Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that the Son of Man is?" And they said, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets." Rather impressive testimony, because these people constitute the Old Testament Hall of Fame of saints here. He said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And as is characteristic throughout Matthew's Gospel, Peter steps forward, or I should say speaks up. Peter's the only one to walk on water. Peter's the one who often speaks up, representative of the 12 disciples. Verse 16, Simon Peter replied, "You are the Christ," the Christos, the anointed one in Greek, or the Messiah in Hebrew, "the Son of the living God. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, Petros, and on this rock, Petra, I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will have been loosed in heaven." And then he strictly charged the disciples to tell no one that he was the Christ. Now, let me just get a little personal here. A couple years before I became a Catholic, I had been studying the doctrine of the covenant. I came to an understanding of the covenant as a family, and with this insight I began to discover all kinds of exciting truths, novel innovations, new discoveries that I thought were really undiscovered before. And then as I began to dig deeper into these libraries, I noticed that time and time again, Catholic scholars, I mean, not just recently, but going all the way back to the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries, in the Middle Ages, the saints and the doctors of the church were consistently coming up with all of my brand new discoveries and teaching them with a kind of ho-hum attitude like, "You all know such and such." And that really, at first it provoked me, and then it scared me, and then it led me to dig deeper and deeper into Catholic sources to see how many of my discoveries they may have found, practically every one of them, except the ones that were false. The Pope, though, was a different matter. For me, the idea of a Pope who claims primacy and succession and infallibility was a presumption, an arrogant presumption that no man should make. But then one day, as I was working through the Gospel of Matthew, because that Gospel builds on the Old Testament more than any other, and especially the idea of David's kingdom. That really seems to be the central thrust of Matthew's Gospel, that Jesus is the Son of David, and he's establishing the kingdom of David. That's how Matthew introduces Jesus. He's the only one of the 4 Gospel writers who traces his genealogy right back to David. And he says, Jesus is the Son of David at the very start of Matthew. That's a common and prominent theme throughout the Gospel. So I wanted to dig deep and see what I found in this particular passage. And on the basis of that discovery, or I should say on the basis of that study, I made some discoveries. First of all, I discovered that when you read in verse 17, Jesus answered him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church." I discovered that all the evidence points to the fact that Peter is the rock. Now you might say, that's as plain as the nose on your face. So what's the excitement of that discovery? Well, non-Catholics are frequently claim that it's Peter's faith that Jesus is speaking of, or Peter's confession that Jesus is speaking of when he says this rock. Or other Protestants object and say, no, Jesus says, "And you are Petros," which is little rock, and on this Petra, the Greek word for large rock, I will build my church. And so some Protestants object to the Catholic view and say, what Jesus is really saying is, you're a little pebble, and on this rock, namely Christ, the rock, Corinthians 10:4 and so on, I will build my church. The closer I studied, the more I realized that those positions were untenable. And I'm going to share in a few minutes the fact that most conservative, anti-Catholic, Protestant scholars today will admit that readily and candidly. The more I dug, the more I found that the evidence pointed to the fact that Jesus was speaking of Peter. Peter's the rock. Peter just said, "You are the Christos." So Jesus says, "You are the Petros." There's a little parallelism there. You are the son of the living God, and you are the son of Jonah. Simon Bar-Jonah, you are the Petros. Now people could say, wait a second. There is a distinction in the Greek language between Petros, Peter's name, and Petra. Petros can mean stone, whereas Petra often means big rock. The problem with that is twofold. First of all, Jesus probably didn't speak Greek when he was with his disciples. I mean, that is held by 99.9% of all scholars. It's overwhelmingly unlikely that Jesus in his normal conversation spoke Greek. What's almost certain is that he spoke Aramaic. And in the Aramaic, there's only one word that could possibly be used. And Jeremias and Kuhlman and other scholars have pointed to the fact that if Jesus spoke Aramaic, he only could have said, "You are Cephas, and on this Cephas I build my church." And so, given our knowledge of the Aramaic language, there's no possibility for Jesus to have made the distinction between little stone and big rock. Well, somebody could say, well, the Holy Spirit inspired Matthew to use two different words. Well, that's true. Because Petra is the word in Greek that's normally used for large rock. But you don't name, I should say Petra is the Greek word that means large rock, but it's in the feminine form. In other words, the gender of this Greek word Petra, large rock, is feminine. You do not apply a feminine form of the word in order to name a male. You adopt it by giving it the masculine form. What Matthew was doing, guided by the Holy Spirit, was something that was rather obvious and practically necessary. And that was to take the Greek form of Jesus saying, and start by saying, "I will build my church on this massive stone, this Petra in the feminine," but then to show that Peter gets the name rock in its proper masculine form. You wouldn't name him, Josephina, Rockina, or, something like that. You give him the masculine form of the word. I should also add that there's absolutely no archaeological evidence from antiquity for anybody having been named Peter before Simon. Jesus was taking a word that had never been used, as far as all the many records we have are concerned, never was used to designate an individual person. And Jesus gives that word to Simon. Again, it suggests the fact that Simon is the rock. I have note cards that I actually put together when I was preparing a paper for a graduate seminar on this subject. I was still a Protestant minister, and I was taking a graduate seminar on the Gospel of Matthew, and the professor was a Protestant, he was a Lutheran. And he knew what I wanted to do for my project, and so I presented this paper, Peter and the Keys. And I worked at it because I knew that he might not be open to my conclusions, and I knew what my conclusions were going to be at the end of my research. They were rather Catholic. And so I worked and I put these note cards together, and when I made the presentation, I should probably add this, it was a very interesting experience because all the other students who presented papers, the professor encouraged the rest of the students to interact with the presenter. And he seldom, if ever, asked questions or interacted. He wanted the students to get involved. But when it came to presenting a 30-page paper, presenting the evidence for the fact that Peter is the rock, and that the keys denote succession, and that the Catholic position is right, not one student spoke up for the entire 2.5-hour seminar. He did all the talking, and we even went over. I ended up leaving the classroom, I think, 45 minutes after the seminar was supposed to end. It was the most grueling cross-examination I'd ever undergone. I think your paper's flawless. The only fault that I found is you have the middle initial on one person's name and one of your footnotes wrong. He said, I think your argument's persuasive, too. I'm just grateful that I don't think that Matthew is historically reliable, so I don't have to follow the conclusions.